Hello everyone and welcome back to another lecture on postcolonial literature. Today we will again pick up the notion of belonging simultaneously to multiple cultural traditions, which we discussed in our previous lecture while talking about cosmopolitanism. And in today's lecture we will explore this idea of multiple cultural affiliations with reference to what is called diasporic literature. And this category of diasporic literature has come to form an integral part of the broader category of postcolonial literature. And in order to understand this concept of diasporic literature, what this umbrella term diasporic literature signifies, I think we should start by defining for ourselves the term diasporic itself, that adjective. Now, diasporic is an adjective that is derived from the noun diaspora, and this noun diaspora has its roots in the Greek language. Now, the word in its Greek form means dispersion and scattering of seeds during the process of sowing. So, it primarily in its original form related to the field of agriculture. However, today the primary understanding of diaspora has changed, and today it relates to the dispersion of people rather than seeds. And this specific association of the concept of diaspora with the dispersion of people rather than with seeds can be traced back, for instance, to the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament of the Bible, where in chapter 28 verse number 25 we find the use of the Greek root word for diaspora, and there it is used to describe how, if the commandments of the God is not followed, then the God will cause the disobedient people to be defeated by their enemy, and the God will cause them to be dispersed from their homeland and to be scattered among all the kingdoms of the earth. Now, while looking at this occurrence, early occurrence of this word diaspora in the Old Testament, which is used to mean a dispersion of people, we need to keep in mind that here the idea of diaspora is closely associated with the notion of exile or of being removed from one's homeland as a form of punishment. And this connection between exile and diaspora most strongly resonates in the history of the Jewish community, which was banished from its homeland in the 6th century BCE after the holy city of Jerusalem was sacked and the temple of Solomon was destroyed by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. Now, this exile, this 6th century BCE exile and the memory of this exile still informs Jewish identity and is an integral part of the cultural memory of the Jewish diaspora, that is the Jewish people who live in different parts of the world dispersed from their homeland. And this sense of exile within the Jewish community is closely entwined with a sense of nostalgia for the lost homeland and a desire to return to it. Now, all these emotional and cultural associations that I have just described to you, referring back to the Old Testament, to the Jewish history, all of these shape our present understanding of the term diaspora. And let me before I proceed any further, let me reiterate the main points again with regards to diaspora, so that we know that we have clearly understood the term diaspora and its various connotations. So, what is diaspora? Firstly, diaspora refers to communities of people living away from what they consider to be their homelands. Secondly, this state of living away from their homeland bears the negative connotation of being in exile. And thirdly and finally, the feeling of being in exile evokes within the diasporic community a sense of nostalgic longing for a lost homeland and a desire to somehow return to that homeland which has been lost. Now, keeping in mind this general characterization of diaspora and diasporic identity, let us now try and see how it relates to postcolonialism and postcolonial literature, because ultimately that is our main concern in this course. Well, as discussed at the very beginning of this lecture series, colonialism connects the two distant spaces of the metropolis and the colonial periphery through a constant traffic of goods, of capital, but most importantly of people. So, in other words, human dispersion and formation of diasporic communities are integral to the process of colonialism itself. Now, in our previous lectures, we have already discussed a bit about the white man who is removed from his homeland in the metropolis and who comes to the colonial periphery, to the colony of the metropolis. And here I am thinking about our discussion of characters like Marlowe in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, someone who comes to Congo, the colonial periphery, from the metropolis, Belgium. And I am also thinking, for instance, of the Christian missionaries as depicted in Chinua Achebe's novel Things Fall Apart, who again are people who have come to Nigeria, the colonial periphery, from the mother country in Europe. But today in our lecture, we are going to discuss an opposite kind of migration, an opposite kind of dispersion that the colonialism gave birth to. And this is the dispersion of the colonized subjects, not the representative of colonial power like Marlowe or the Christian missionaries, but the dispersion of colonized subjects from their homelands, and the migration of these people from the colonial periphery to the metropolis. However, before we deal with that, it is again important to remember that not every dispersion of colonial subjects from their homelands meant a gathering in the European mother country or in the Western metropolis. Many people were simply displaced during colonialism from one area of the colonial periphery to another, from one colony to another. And here, for instance, we have already discussed this when we discussed Derek Walcott, but I am thinking, for instance, of the dispersion of slaves and indentured laborers during colonialism from places like India, for instance, and Africa. And these dispersed laborers and slaves and sort of bonded laborers, they were gathering, they were being dispersed from colonies like India and Africa, but they were gathering not necessarily in the metropolis, but they were gathering in another part of the colonial periphery, like for instance the Caribbean, where these bonded laborers, these slave labor was necessary to run the sugar plantations, for instance. Now, as I said, we have already discussed this particular kind of migration when we talked about Derek Walcott. And Walcott, if you remember, is the legacy bearer of the African diasporic community who gathered in the Caribbean during the days of slavery. After slavery was banned during the early 19th century, indentured laborers took their places, and the Indian novelist Amitabh Ghosh, in his Ibis trilogy, especially in the first novel in the Ibis trilogy, Sea of Poppies, he describes in details how these indentured laborers were gathered from various parts of India, for instance, using different degrees of coercion and persuasion, and then they were shipped to distant colonies, distant colonial plantations to work as bonded laborers. And to give you an example, the ancestors of the Nobel Prize winning Caribbean author V.S. Naipaul, they migrated from India to Caribbean in this similar fashion to serve in the plantations there. And in fact, Naipaul in his writings give a very vivid glimpse into the ways of life of diasporic community of Indians that started taking shape in the Caribbean from the 19th century. However, these dispersions of colonized subjects within the colonial periphery was also supplemented by significant waves of migration that reached from the colonies to the metropolis. And let us take for instance the relation between the metropolitan Britain and the colonized India. Indians started arriving in Britain from South Asia, different parts of South Asia really, as early as the 17th century. And these people who were arriving in Britain during the early days were primarily servants employed by British households, but they were also sailors, diplomats and savants. One of the most interesting Indian migrants to Britain during this early period was a man called Sheikh Deen Muhammad. And Deen Muhammad was born in Bihar in 1759, and he migrated to Britain in 1782. And there he introduced what he referred to as shampoo baths, and he also introduced Indian cuisine in Europe while becoming the first Indian author to publish a book in English. And this book, which was published in 1794 under the title The Travels of Deen Muhammad, is simultaneously regarded as the first major work of Indian English writing, Indian English literature, as well as the first major work of Indian diasporic literature in English. Now, the group of servants, sailors and diplomats were soon supplemented and then almost overshadowed by the population of Indian students who started arriving in Britain from India from around the 1840s. And this migration that started during the 1840s hasn't stopped yet. And it is interesting to note that many of our Indian nationalists like M.K. Gandhi, for instance, Subhash Chandra Bose, Jawaharlal Nehru, B.R. Ambedkar, they all went to Britain for their higher studies. So, this connection between India and Britain and the migration of students from the colonized India to the colonial metropolis in Britain has played a really very significant role in the history both of Britain and of India. Now, these various waves of migration from the colonial periphery to the mother country established a number of diasporic communities within the metropolis, and the category diasporic literature refers to the literature produced by these displaced people who migrated from the colonial periphery in the global south and who gathered in the metropolitan centers in the global north. And we need to note here that these metropolitan centers that we are talking about not only includes places like Britain or France or Spain, but it also includes America today, because America in many ways have inherited the mantle of the colonial West. Now, as a literature that reflects the displaced condition of its author, diasporic writing is expectedly informed by the pangs and pains of exile, and it is also informed by a nostalgic desire to reunite with the homeland that has been lost during the migration. And this sense of exile and nostalgia forms the keynote which unites the otherwise mind-bogglingly wide variety of diasporic literature produced in Britain, France, Spain, America by people coming from different parts of the world like India, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean islands. So, in our lecture today, we will try and understand this wide variety of literature that is categorized under the title of diasporic literature by focusing on one particular instance. It is a story by the author Jhumpa Lahiri, and by focusing on that short story, it is a very poignant and very beautiful short story. We will come to that shortly, but in focusing on that short story, our intention would be to identify the key concepts of exile and nostalgia, nostalgia for the homeland, that informs the diasporic condition in general and diasporic literature in particular. But before we move on to the story, let me introduce the author to you. Jhumpa Lahiri was born in 1969 in London, and she was born to Bengali parents who had migrated from Calcutta. But Jhumpa Lahiri was not really brought up in England. She was raised primarily in the east coast of United States, where her parents migrated when she was only 2. More recently, Lahiri has shifted base again, and now she resides with her husband and 2 children in Rome, the capital of Italy. And this diasporic identity of Lahiri, this history of migration and exile, has created for her a unique location in the interstices or in the gaps of different cultures, and she identifies herself as writing from a position of marginality, where limits of different cultures meet, or if they do not meet, they leave a very interesting gap from within which one can look at these different cultures and combine various elements and write about them. But nevertheless, we also need to understand that this marginality, this interstices, represents a gap, a sense of lack, a sense of loss. And we understand this sense of lack and sense of loss from Lahiri's own writings and interviews about herself, where she says that, for instance, though she was born to Bengali parents, her knowledge of Bengali is only partial, and this sense of lack of her partial knowledge of her mother tongue has informed her cultural identity. On the other hand, though Lahiri was brought up in America, her desire to keep alive her connection with her Bengali roots has meant that Lahiri could only partially assimilate herself within America. And Lahiri's move to Italy has only accentuated this sense of being a marginal entity who does not fully belong to any one particular culture and who cannot firmly identify any one place as her home. Now, this sense of being without a fixed cultural as well as spatial home strongly informs all of Jhumpa Lahiri's works, be it her novels like The Namesake or The Lowland, or her celebrated collection of short stories like Interpreter of Melodies, or the more recent one titled Unaccustomed Earth. But whereas the state of being an exile informs Lahiri's writings with a sense of lack and loss, it also informs them with a tremendous sense of multicultural possibilities. Again, as I said, the interstices, the margin, the gap between the culture, it is a gap, therefore it signifies a lack, a loss, a sense of not belonging to any of the cultures. But again, that gap, that interstices, is also filled with multicultural possibilities. It is a position from which one can borrow, one can appropriate elements from different cultures, right? And this is what happens with Jhumpa Lahiri too, because by freeing oneself from the confines of one's homeland and one's native culture, the condition of being an exile can make a person an heir to all cultures in the world. By not belonging to any one culture, you actually become an heir to all cultures, and that opens a tremendous amount of possibilities of bringing together eclectic cultural elements to shape your own identity. And such a stance, such a possibility is realized by Lahiri in her attempt, for instance, to learn Italian, the language of the country that she now resides in. And she is trying to make both that language, that culture and that country her own now. And in her latest book titled In Altre Parole, which is originally written in Italian but which has been translated in English under the title In Other Words, gives us an account of this difficult and rewarding attempt to appropriate for oneself a language and culture to which one is neither born nor exposed to while growing up. Jhumpa Lahiri's life and literature therefore shows the cultural possibilities that the condition of being born and brought up in a diaspora throws up. But Lahiri is also keenly aware of the sense of alienation that this diasporic condition entails. And the migration from one's homeland can make one an heir to multiple cultures. Yes, that is a possibility, but Lahiri realizes that it can also as easily shut one out from all sense of cultural rootedness. And the claustrophobic sense of a cultural vacuum that a migration from the homeland can create for an individual is beautifully depicted by Lahiri in her short story that we are going to read today, and that short story is titled Mrs. Sens, and it is there in the collected book of short stories which won the Pulitzer Prize, titled Interpreter of Melodies. And it is to this short story that we will now turn. This story, Mrs. Sens, is narrated by an American boy named Eliot, and it tells of the time that Eliot spent with his Bengali babysitter that Eliot only knows as, whom Eliot only knows as Mrs. Sen. Who is Mrs. Sen? Well, Mrs. Sen is a wife of Mr. Sen who migrated from Calcutta to America to take up a job to teach mathematics in a university. And this is a very crucial part of her identity. Her identity, at least in America, refers back not to something that she is herself, but refers back to her husband who has a job in an American university. So, from the very beginning, we do not even in fact know the name of this Mrs. Sen that we are introduced to, the first name of her. So, there is a sense of lack of identity that surrounds this entity of Mrs. Sen, making her slightly mysterious to us. Now, Mr. Sen has a job in a university. He remains occupied, but the migration from Calcutta to America has meant for Mrs. Sen a painful uprooting from her familiar Bengali socio-cultural milieu, and most importantly from her family. To fill the sense of lack that the loss of her homeland creates for Mrs. Sen, she tries to cling to the memory of the tiniest details that gave substance to her life back in Calcutta. And it is Calcutta which she still wistfully refers to as her home. In America, Mrs. Sen tries to recreate that lost home of Calcutta by repeatedly rereading the letters that she occasionally receives from her people back home. She also listens to the familiar sounds of Indian classical music and of her relatives talking by playing cassettes in a cassette player, and most importantly, she tries to recreate her lost homeland through her cooking of Bengali dishes. Now, this very attempt to live the memories of Calcutta in America and this attempt to transform an American space into a Bengali home creates for Mrs. Sen a cocoon of isolation that is cut off from the immediate reality outside. And Mrs. Sen's failure to come to terms with America and her conflict with the new physical reality of this foreign land is exposed in the story through references to Mrs. Sen's inability to drive on American roads. And the tension between the Bengali inner reality that Mrs. Sen creates within her apartment and the outside reality of the American roads reach a breaking point when one day Mrs. Sen decides to drive herself with Elliot sitting next to her, and she decides to go to a fish shop to buy some fresh fish so that she can prepare her Bengali dish. Now, this attempt by Mrs. Sen to go and procure a quintessential item that is needed for her Bengali dish from the outside American space ends in a minor accident, and neither Elliot nor Mrs. Sen is very grievously hurt, but nevertheless Elliot's mother stops sending him to Mrs. Sen's, and the last thing that Elliot remembers of his Bengali babysitter is the sound of crying coming out of the bedroom of her apartment within which Mrs. Sen had locked herself in. In a way, Mrs. Sen, with her inability to break free from the cocoon of memory of a remembered homeland and her inability to connect with the outside space, resulting ultimately in a psychological breakdown, represents the opposite of what Jhumpa Lahiri is. the diasporic author who is confident in her ability to appropriate and make her own disparate elements from different cultures. But the very fact that Lahiri creatively engages with characters like Mrs. Sen shows a desire to recognize and address the difficulty that a migrant faces in connecting with the outside reality following her displacement and uprooting. The isolation of Mrs. Sen's apartment and the sound of sobbing that comes out of her bedroom thus forms the dark underside of the diasporic condition, which is otherwise marked by the luminosity of eclectic cultural possibilities. With this exploration of Jhumpa Lahiri and her work, we conclude our discussion of diasporic literature today. In our next meeting, we will take up the work of Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, a very important theorist in the field of postcolonial studies. Thank you.